So I like to start, not a lot of time, but maybe just taking a couple of minutes to arrive. So even though we're here virtually, there's still something involved in, logging in and getting prepared to participate in a class. So, just a minute of quiet and to bring to mind our own personal motivation, what it is, why we're here today, what we hope to get out of it. Um, you know, there may be some short-term sort of goals that we have, but then, really consciously trying to tap into those highest spiritual goals that we have and setting that as our motivation. Okay, and when you're ready, we can come back into this virtual shared space. So I am really happy to be here. I love what I love about this class. I love that it seems to be rather unstructured. And in other words, being able to kind of decide, how to sort of present some ideas to start a conversation. And in preparation, I sat in live on one of Murray Wright's classes. He's a very old Dharma friend. He was actually at Land of Medicine Buddha many, many years ago, before I lived there and for the first part of my being there. So that was really fantastic, just lovely. And then I listened to some of Rabina's classes and Karuna and other old friends. And everyone has their very unique kind of way of presenting things. And I think as fantastic as this forum is, in terms of we can be spread around, people can digest it at their leisure, since there is a YouTube recorded version as well. Participation, it seems like, is sort of hit or miss. So I thought, okay, it's open-ended, but I need to have a framework. And so hopefully the framework that I kind of settled on is going to be helpful. And I know Kodo has been practicing for many years. Michael, we haven't had a chance to really get to know each other at all around that. But, hopefully this is going to be useful for people, whether they've been practicing for a long time or, just kind of starting to practice or starting to put a framework around an existing practice, which I think there's been in the last course I did, there were people like that as well who had been, practicing maybe in other traditions, had a personal meditation practice, but maybe hadn't, gone to a lot of Buddhist courses or were kind of new to the tradition. So hopefully it'll be helpful. So what I decided to do, when I think about Dharma, the totality of it is being your own therapist, which is why this course is incredibly wide open, because that's exactly what we're really trying to do, whether or not it's presented directly that way. We are experimentalists. We are, hopefully taking a sort of scientific approach to our own minds. And so, that's like, okay, well, it really is wide open. And I thought, why not take it sort of like Lam Rim, in some stages that I think make sense. So like everything in Dharma, pretty much, it can be categorized a lot of different ways. But one of the ways of talking about Lam Rim that Jade Tsongkhapa, who's the founder of this particular lineage, the Gelug lineage, if you didn't know, you probably know, a text called the three principles of the path. Sometimes it's called principal aspects of the path, but he lays out Lam Rim in three kind of distinct chunks. So the first is really about renunciation. And you can think of it as three things that we, if in our quest to become liberated, and then that's another question from what, in our quest to become liberated, three realizations that we want to cultivate within our own mind. And so there's an academic aspect to all of this stuff, but really it's about getting these realizations. So the first is renunciation. I'll just list them now. I'm going to do for this first, like maybe 10 minutes, a few lists, and then we'll talk about them. So renunciation is the first thing. And then from that, bodhicitta. And then lastly, wisdom. It's often called the correct view, which sounds sort of militant, at least did to my ears the first time I heard it. But it's an understanding of reality. And those are teachings on emptiness. And of course, we want to get that realization. So we want to realize renunciation, realize bodhicitta in our hearts, and realize emptiness, have a direct realization of that. And so I thought for this first hour, I'd focus on renunciation, and then next week, bodhicitta, and then the third week we'll talk about emptiness, and then the fourth week I thought let's talk about some methods. So kind of focusing on Lojong, mind training. So I don't want to talk a ton, but I want to give us a foundation or some common ground to have a discussion around. So, I kind of said, we're seeking liberation. And I think, and I'll be frank, for much of my early Buddhist education, I was really focused on bodhicitta. And I think that's not so uncommon. I think we have some innate. let me not start out on the wrong foot. Most of us have imprints and a desire to help others, and oftentimes that's what leads us to the path. And so the teachings on bodhicitta, the teachings on loving kindness, those I think have a lot of appeal. And I was really focused on those, and I think a little bit to my detriment, where I had kind of skated over renunciation. And, I'm not so sure. Maybe part of it is I didn't like the idea. I really didn't like the idea of giving things up. And I think largely that came from a misunderstanding of what I would be giving up. So I thought, let's make it clear from the onset, because I wasn't clear from the onset in my Buddhist life, that what we're renouncing is suffering. We're renouncing suffering, samsara, and the causes of suffering. So, Lord Buddha's first teachings as an enlightened being were around the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, that there is a cessation, and then the path. And so renunciation is about seeking liberation from that suffering, from samsara, which quite frankly is sort of hard to do when you're experiencing it as a pleasure growth. And that's why a lot of us come to the Buddhist path or any spiritual path, because we get a taste of the reality of suffering. And sometimes when we're, and I've found in my personal life, when I've experienced a lot of obvious suffering, there's more of a fire to my practice, quite frankly. It's a little bit more challenging when things are working. So, this precious human rebirth, that's one of the things that makes it so incredibly valuable, is we have this perfect mix of, enough pleasure to sort of keep us motivated, but enough suffering that we can tune into that as a truth, as the reality. And then, of course, we have, the faculties and intellect and all of these other things that go along with that. But I think it's important to just think about, and I don't know either of you, it's our first time meeting and other people may listen to this, but, why is it important to have renunciation? Why is it the, foundation of the path? Because if we don't know what we're trying to get out of, if we don't know what we're trying to be liberated from, then there's, no hope that that's going to actually happen for us. So as a baseline, understanding that. So that's kind of the first list of, 3 principal aspects of the path and 4 noble truths. If you hadn't heard it, you probably have before. But then, so what does it mean? And I think here's another kind of misunderstanding sometimes, is that renunciation has to do with not enjoying things in this life, right? We're supposed to be austere and serious and poor and not have anything. And that's a misunderstanding, right? But so I wanted to touch on, a couple things that help us along the way. So as we're trying to develop, and we are doing these things concurrently, right? So, I don't know anybody. I suppose there are renunciates who are really focusing on that and not really focusing on developing bodhicitta. And in fact, they lower scope. I don't know if there's really any lower scope people out there, but, technically there are people who are just focused on getting out of samsara. And they may not be overtly focused on developing bodhicitta, but I think these are natural things that follow on one another. If you weren't inclined to bodhicitta, I would say that if you really understood suffering, it would give rise to your own personal wish to be free. And then really right after that, coming out of that, you would wish for that for all beings. You know what? Forgive me. I just realized I'm talking and I have a virtual background on, which is kind of annoying me. So I'm going to be real. That was for work. It's my Zoom default. Hi, Shayla. Welcome. So I'm just kind of laying some groundwork for discussion, and then I'm going to stop talking and hopefully we'll have more of a conversation. So there's these 3 trainings, which are morality, meditation, and wisdom. So these are the things, these are the tools that are going to help us develop all of those 3 aspects of the path. So they're what we're going to rely on. And morality is important because as we're trying to become our own therapists, we have to understand what's working for us and what's working against us. So what I love about Buddhist morality, quite frankly, is that it's not arbitrary. It's incredibly functional. It's, when we talk about why something is a non-virtue, it isn't a moral, it isn't a judgment on others, one. And the other comment I'll make about Buddhist morality is truly it applies to one person, myself. And of course, and I would say my teachers, right? Because if I'm going to, if I'm going to look to others for guidance, then it applies to them. But for the most part, it's not about minding what someone else should be doing. It's really about applying Buddhist morality to ourselves. And if we're doing a good job of that, it gets more and more subtle, and we're finding pockets of where we're missing the mark. And again, that's important because it's functional. So I'm going to rattle off the 10 non-virtues, which you probably know, but for anyone who doesn't, we've got 3 of body, so killing, and that's defined as killing at its minimal level. Killing a human being or a human fetus is included in that. Stealing anything of value, which is open to interpretation, but we know it. We know it when we see it. We know it when we do it. Sexual misconduct, which is really defined as breaking your vows. So if you're in a relationship, if you're ordained, engaging in behavior that you've made a promise not to do. Lying, so the next are of speech: lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, gossip or idle talk. And then the next 3 are of mind. So there's 4 of speech, which should be a tip off that we can do a lot of damage with this thing. That's one I have to be really careful of because I like to talk. And you talk a lot. Sometimes you enter a path that you don't, that isn't helpful. So always kind of asking ourselves, why am I saying this? What's my motivation? Is it true? Is it helpful? What am I trying to accomplish? The last 3 are of mind. So jealousy or covetousness. And I say that's, begrudging someone else some kind of happiness. Ultimately, if you're kind of we may not feel like we're green with envy, but some subtle little thing of like not wanting someone to have something that makes them happy. Ill will, self-explanatory, wishing bad things on others. I find that's a challenging one when I'm talking about what seems like theoretical things like politics, right? That's for me, sometimes I'll have a thought and then I really have to stop myself and say, wait a minute, I really don't want anything terrible to happen to these people. Even sometimes we say, well, karma. And I think of karma and then maybe there's a flash of a wish, like that they'll get their negative karma back, like that's a non-virtue for me, for any of us who are trying to practice this path. And then wrong view, which typically when you talk about correct view, you mean emptiness and understanding of reality. But this is in terms of we haven't had that realization. So really what we're talking about here is a sort of a willful ignorance. So, willfully denying cause and effect as existing, or willfully denying past or future lives, or rebirth, or Four Noble Truths. So it's not the same as having like a healthy questioning mind, which actually Lord Buddha, that's another thing we sort of as Buddhists have signed up for, which is to be questioning, to use our intellect, not to take things on blind faith, develop a practice of our own. So what this means is if something like, and this is really important when we talk about renunciation, because for the most part, if we're not thinking about future lives, then we're not really practicing Dharma. We can be using the methods and we can be benefiting from that, but we're not really attacking that suffering. We're not really creating the causes for enlightenment. So it's okay that we don't, we can't see future lives directly, and we're supposed to be questioning things, and it's healthy to question. So the idea here is, have maybe some healthy questions, like it's not resolved, it isn't proven to me, but does it make sense? Do all the other things that I've been practicing, have they been helping me? Do I have reason to trust Buddha, Lord Buddha? Do I have reason to trust Buddha and Buddhist teachings? And if I do, then maybe I can say, okay, this one, I can't experience directly. And karma is this way as well. So you've got the realization of emptiness, which is a very important and one of the last things that we realize as an ordinary being. So that's pretty advanced. But so future lives, the workings of karma are all things that normal people can't see. Karma is something that even a person who has seen emptiness directly, only a Buddha can see directly someone's karma. So these are things that we take on faith, but hopefully it's an educated faith. So, the reason that I'm talking about all these things is I think when we look at wanting to become our own therapist, wanting to attain liberation, it's important in our daily life to remember renunciation, right? Remember what our actual goal is, and then try to work on things that are going to help us develop that realization. And so I have some other ideas of things I wanted to kind of talk about in relation to that. But before I start launching into that, I'd love to pause, and I'd love, without pressure, I welcome and would love, this to be a collaborative discussion. Anything come up? Anything triggered?
Well, for me.
Any questions? Any debate? Anything? And again, it's okay. We can have quiet, and then I'll wait a minute, and then I'll move on. Okay.
Well, I have something.
Yay.
I mean, I'm very new to Tibetan. So I've been doing Zazen and other practices of other types for many years. But what got me really interested was my inquiry or my curiosity about karma. And so when I think of karma, I don't think of just an action. I think of it more as my own urge that is the cause of the action, right? It's the beginning, the predecessor.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I keep an urge or a karma notebook, and I've been tracking as best I can, and writing down just like 2 or 3 words, tracking my urges all day long. It's insane. So
Lama Zopa Rinpoche has encouraged students to essentially kind of track their mind. How often am I getting angry? What's making me, looking at our minds. I've had so many other teachers. It's an incredible practice. You really start to see things, So we talk about the 10 non-virtues, but if we're going for liberation, these are sort of like the minimal entry points, right? So you start to look at, and all right, I'm gonna go way out there on a limb and say none of us are probably killers, right? And but what are the things sort of around in the realm of that, in the spirit of that? And again, it's not about judging others. It's really looking at ourselves, and then why? Why? Well, because every being like us wants to be happy. Every being wants to, craves their own existence. Actually, that's kind of a problem if you want to get out of samsara, the craving of our own existence. But it's a reality. So, out of kindness towards others, how can we take that one action and use guideline, use it as a guideline to perfect ourselves. And then here's another thing that I think can feel daunting to acknowledge, but I think it's important to acknowledge. As we practice the path to enlightenment, that is exactly what we are working on, perfecting ourselves. And that sounds, the world will tell you nothing's perfect, no one's perfect, it's impossible. Lord Buddha has told us there's a path and it's possible. So, no matter how far we feel from that, just working slowly. And to your point, karma, and I think maybe probably the third week I'll talk a little bit more about karma, but there's laws, of karma, right? And they're pretty simple. They're pretty much also the metaphor of a physical seed is very good for, well, I'll just go ahead and say the 4 laws of karma. So, like creates like. So you're not going to get a watermelon from an acorn, just not going to happen. So for our purposes, we could say, merit is going to create something that's going to be good or positive. Seeds grow. That's another law. If you don't plant it, there's absolutely no way you're going to get the results. And that's why it's important to develop that renunciation. And that's why it's important to kind of even have it on our radar, frankly, as practitioners, which I'm admitting early on, it wasn't something I focused on. And the last one is, if you do, and this is the good one for if you tend to lean towards getting discouraged, if you do plant the seed and you provide the right conditions, you will definitely get a result. And I think that's really important to remember. So, Master Shantideva in Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and now I'm getting into the bodhicitta, but it's kind of hard not to, we'll talk about it all. He says, give first, carrots, potatoes, small things that we can happily do. And that's important too. And I will talk more about karma, because rejoicing in the good things that we do is very, very important. It's one of those conditions. You can think of it as like fertilizer, right? So when we're done, with our hour today, we'll take a minute to dedicate, the time that we spent. And we may not think like, oh, this wasn't the, earth-shattering teaching. I've gone to teachings before where I am incredibly moved and totally inspired, and I have no illusions that I'm probably not going to, light that fire in you guys. It's okay. But this is good time that we're spending together. We came together for something higher and purposeful. We set a motivation. And then at the end, dedicating that and feeling happy, is so we're putting it in the storehouse for the future, and we're investing it, and we're supercharging it with just taking a minute to be happy with what we did. It's just so important. It's so important. So, so Buddhism is talking about what are we going to, in our quest for liberation from samsara, in our efforts to get out of suffering. And just briefly, I'll talk about 3 kinds of suffering. I said I would do a little list for people, which you may like or not like, you may know or not know, but probably somebody out there never heard it before. So there's different kinds of suffering. So the first is suffering, the suffering of suffering. It's the stuff that we recognize as being horrible and painful. No problem identifying that. I think an interesting thing, and maybe this is just how my psychology works, but I think what happens in the world is because there is this gross suffering, we develop a tolerance for suffering. We develop this thing where, and some of it can be a healthy tool, but just to know that we're doing it. I can't feel bad about this because someone else, because of what's happening in Ukraine and other people have it worse. That can be helpful to provide perspective so that we're not wallowing in some kind of self-centeredness. But also just be mindful that we're not developing a tolerance for suffering. Because I think it's very easy to decide that, my whatever suffering is nothing or unimportant. or worse, to decide that someone else, a friend or a loved one, that their pain is trivial. It can feel overwhelming when you really look. But as a warrior against suffering, as a person who wants to get out, and then bodhicitta, which is wanting others out, I think we should develop a zero tolerance policy. Truly, like none of it is okay. It's horrible. And, not to allow ourselves to become so overwhelmed that we can't function, but just to acknowledge, even just for a moment, I can't do anything about that, but that's a heartbreak. And there is no heartbreak. It's so easy to have almost a competition, right? Like what problem is worse and worse than someone else's. And we do it to ourselves. We do it to our loved ones. I think it's super helpful to develop, a desire to get rid of suffering, period. And all of it for everyone, the for everyone part is bodhicitta. All of it is, I think we could say, renunciation, certainly for ourselves. And I think it makes it easier to be kind to ourselves when we recognize our own suffering. Loneliness. The last class, I want us to do some lojong. And, one of the things, I love doing Tonglen practice. I don't know, some of you may or may not be familiar, but I think it's really important sometimes to think about ourselves. If we can't develop compassion for ourselves, then we sure can't develop it for others. Then we are really fooling ourselves. This one, I know this one. I know her stupidities. I know her failures. I know how hard she's tried. I know her aspirations. If I can't cultivate just a little bit of compassion for myself, then it will never happen for others. And I used to have a little quote, Lama Yeshe basically saying, like, be gentle with yourself first, then you can be gentle with others. We can be, and maybe I'm speaking for me mostly, but that's kind of what I have to draw from experientially. But I see it in friends also. Like we can be so hard and rigid with ourselves. Even, preparing to like teach a Dharma course, it's incredibly humbling, because I'm just another person on the path. I don't have any realizations, but I've been trying. I've been working on this for a really long time. And so instead of like, oh, I'm not good enough, or how can I, like, we all have something we can offer to each other, right? When we get out of our own way. And I think sometimes that being hard on ourselves is just another expression of ego or self-centeredness. Like maybe, I'll teach a class tonight and I'll make a total ass of myself, but maybe that will help somebody else to not do the very same thing, right? So yeah, just being gentle with ourselves, I think, is really important. And now I've gone off on a little self-tangent and I kind of lost where I wanted to go, or a skillful way of getting there. I've lost the segue, but I'll just go for it. So we're looking at what are the things to take up? What are the things that we want to do on this path? What's helpful? And those are the three trainings, morality, concentration, meditation, and wisdom. Those are the things we want to beef up, the perfections. What do we want to give up? We want to give up the non-virtues, 10 non-virtues, among other things. And then there's these things that are good to watch out for. And for me, these are where the gotchas are. And you've probably heard like 8 worldly dharmas. What are the 8 worldly dharmas? So I haven't talked about the perfections, but just briefly, and I'll talk more about them probably next time. One of the perfections is generosity. So what does it mean to be generous? Does it mean giving up everything? Is it okay to have things? What does renunciation mean? Is it okay to enjoy things? If we ever are at a loss, and this really speaks to becoming your own therapist, being your own therapist, know the 8 worldly dharmas. So what are they? So briefly, gain and loss. So what does that mean? Liking when we get stuff, not liking when we don't get stuff. If you're like me, you might be thinking, well, that's not so helpful. I do like when I get stuff. I don't like when I don't get stuff. So when is it a problem? It's a problem when I would be willing to do something non-virtuous or to avoid doing something virtuous in order to have the pleasure of getting something or avoiding the displeasure of not getting something. Does that make sense? So would it be nice to be wealthy? Absolutely, yes. I have watched, I have watched, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and it's amazing the first time it happens to you or you see it. So he is just a virtue machine. So he gets something with this hand and he's like super quickly getting rid of it with the next hand. He's using his resources though in a way that help him and help others, and no conflict there. No conflict. You actually have to be helping yourself first in order to be beneficial to other beings. You have to, take care of this one so that you can benefit. So, but what'll happen is someone will offer something to Lama Zopa and he will take it and he will enjoy it in that moment. And then the next minute he could be giving that very thing away to someone else. He has a house in Aptos, and many years ago, a lot of people, and I'm sure still to the maintaining it, but a lot of people work incredibly hard to make everything so beautiful for him, and it is. It's a beautiful Pure Land. So, and many of the centers the same thing. So they're making the rooms beautiful, and they're doing beautiful gardening, and they're having beautiful statues and all of these things. And Rinpoche shows up, and I wasn't there, but one of my friends was actually there who had worked on it. And she said it was so mind-blowing because, with our own mind, if I went into a place and I saw, people had created this, I would be thinking for me, and I would, love it and be looking at it, I don't know, with my eyes that appreciate things in an unenlightened way. Lama Zopa Rinpoche immediately stopped everything and was like, this is so wonderful, and began to make prayers. I mean, to me, it's amazingly inspiring. Hours and hours of, I don't want to be weird and get to sentiment, but hours and hours of prayers for every living being who worked on the house, gave to the house, the creatures who were disrupted during the construction of the house, every living being, whether it was the wood that was coming from it and harvesting that, anyone who participated in that, anyone who was affected in that, everyone who could ever be affected, all of his teachers, like for him, receiving something was with that, like, may it be useful. And the gratitude of not just those beings who, went and by the way, did a great virtue for themselves as well, but not just for those people who spent their time and money on it, but for really, just a broader, I would say all living beings. And I suppose if you have the time, and sometimes if you ever go to a teaching of Lama Zopa's, or if you've ever heard it, sometimes when he's doing the dedications, it feels like he is naming every living being. But you definitely get a very real sense that they are in his vision, that kind of gratitude. So does that make him happy? Gaining something? I would say absolutely yes. You can see it. But also when things go, and that has happened before as well. Centers, resources, they're gone. And it's like, okay, that happened. not grasping at things, not being willing to do the kind of crazy gymnastics that we do to get what we want. And when we suffer a loss, then thinking about karma, there's tools we can use, like, okay, I didn't have the karma for that. And that hurt. So I've purified something, and rejoicing that someone else got something. All of those are things we can do to help. So that's the first of the pairs. So when you're talking 8 worldly dharmas, that's the first one. The second one is feeling good and not feeling good. So being happy when things are nice, getting nice things, feeling nice. And I should also say gain and loss. So forgive me, it could also be the victory, right? So gain and loss isn't always something material, right? It can be other things. So feeling good and not feeling good. Being happy when things are going our way and we're feeling good, whether it's physically or mentally, and conversely not. Again, not a problem. We're going to feel good. It's not that in itself is a problem, but it's what is it doing to us? How is it motivating us? Again, so, well, I'm going to wait. I have a story, but I'll wait till I get to the next couple of. So again, you get the sense of what it is we're looking at. It's like, am I willing to do something non-virtuous, or am I avoiding doing something virtuous in order to kind of cater to this 8 worldly dharmas? It's all the stuff that kind of keeps samsara going, frankly. A nice way of kind of summarizing it. The next one is being liked or not being liked. So this is about reputation. A lot of times when you read it, it'll say, being famous. Like most of us were like, okay, I'm not famous. I'm not troubled by the fact that I'm not famous. But this one applies to us too. Like what happens, and it's kind of related to the next one, but what happens when people, don't like us? What happens? What if someone thinks something about us? They have an opinion about us. I find these last two kind of insidious, really doing things to put a vision of who I am in someone else's head. It's crazy. And I think for me, I can say I've had very close, intimate relationships, like a husband. And even when it wasn't working, even when I was like, okay, this is really not helping either of us, something about what I wanted the picture of me to be in his head kept me in something that wasn't helpful anymore, and again, maybe it's more, I think we all, it's sort of like some people, their big things are anger, and some people, their big problems are attachment. And just when I think I know anger's not mine, then I find, oh, well, you're really not, you're defining anger way too broadly, right? Get a little more subtle and you'll find it. I think if we're here, it's proof that we've got these things in our minds. And so knowing what they are, then we can actually go after them. So the last one I said is related, and it's liking praise and not liking criticism. So, there is a scriptural story. It's probably some of the best stories are told as applying to the lives of multiple Buddhist saints. I don't remember anybody that this was applied to, but I remember hearing that, and multiple teachers use this example, that there was a renunciant, a meditator, who was doing a lot of long retreat. And like most people who do long retreats, or, lamas, they have sponsors, they have people who help them. And so just prior to this sponsor coming to visit, this meditator who had been focused on the right thing, right? Who had been focused on his mind and his meditation practice, decided to put that aside to make everything look really good for the sponsor who was coming. So I need to really, and look, offerings on your altar are important. All of the, it's not that these things are not important, but it's a matter of priorities. And so, he made extra concerted effort that his altar would look really great and the offerings, and he spent a lot of time on them. Again, though, spent the time on the offerings, not as an offering to the Buddhas, not as an offering to the Dharma, but to show for this sponsor to see that they were practicing, right? So caring about reputation, or maybe not wanting to be criticized. It could be either of those things. And then, through his great karma and good fortune, caught himself, realized what he was doing, because you're thinking about how are the 8 worldly dharmas at work in me, in my mind. And I'll tell you, when they're at work, it's not healthy either. It doesn't make us happy, even in the short term. So according to the story, he just threw a bunch of dirt on his altar, again, for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons, not throwing dirt on holy images. We want to be careful. But he was fighting against 8 worldly dharmas. And then the story goes that his teacher was in another place who had some clairvoyance and suddenly got very happy and was laughing. And they said, what happened? And he said, so-and-so, realized renunciation, or, realized 8 worldly dharmas. Somebody had a realization. And I think they are that powerful. And, for me personally, before meeting the Dharma, I did a lot of really nice things. I was a very generous person. I tend to be a generous person. But my generosity was really for the wrong reasons. So this, back to Buddhist morality and judging others. Exactly. You never know why someone's doing something, including ourselves. If we're not looking, we often don't know. What's my motivation? Why am I doing this? When I became a Buddhist, I did less nice things overtly for a period of time. I started having boundaries because it was less important what people thought. And frankly, it was more important that what I did was sustainable for me as a practice. So without going into it too much, because I will probably the last time, in the third one, when we're talking about wisdom and karma, talk about just like you can fertilize a seed, you can also damage it. And one of the ways is regretting. So just like rejoicing is like a fertilizer for our good deeds, regretting a good deed is, it damages the seed. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's very subtly, and this hasn't been technically explained to me, but logically, it makes sense. This is how it makes sense to me, is that we are disowning the action. We're not claiming it, right? So running around doing nice things and then the next day regretting it, you'd be better off not to do the nice thing. Do what you can do happily. I mentioned earlier, Master Shantideva talking about, give, carrots and potatoes, right? So that someday you can pluck the eye from your head. But the idea isn't, when the time comes to do an appropriate action like that, which, I'm wondering, why does anyone want an eyeball? But theoretically, they could want one or need one. But the time will come, if we practice, if we create the causes, the time will come when we can actually do that in a genuine, joyful way. And that's when it becomes appropriate. So, early Dharma students, I don't know, I'll tell you what I did. I got rid of everything I owned and I went and I moved into a Dharma center. That's what I did when I met the Dharma. And what happened is I got to meet myself, like, oh, a grand gesture does not enlightenment make, right? It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So being gentle with ourselves and like stretching, but slowly, right? Like if you have a rubber band or you've got anything and you put too much pressure on it, it'll snap. And I've known people who I even had, Dharma jealousy, also not a good, I'll tell you all my bad qualities. It's good to get them out there because then you can't hide, right? I can't pretend to be holy if I tell you all the weird things that have gone on in my mind. But, I used to look at people sometimes and be envious, like instead of just rejoicing in the good qualities that they were manifesting at the time, I would be jealous, or jealous of, the seeming attention that they had or whatever. What I found though is, and not a comparison because that's not healthy either. But some of that stuff that I'm like, well, it's some people can do something for a short period of time, but then they burn themselves out. So while they were doing good and virtuous things, they were stretching themselves beyond what they were capable of really doing. And so I think that's a kind of wisdom that we need to just know about ourselves. Just watching, take care of yourself and definitely rejoicing when other people are engaged in virtue. So you don't want to be someone who doesn't encourage people to do virtuous things. But I think being a good Dharma friend is maybe just reminding them also that, hey, can you do this happily? So maybe it's not the time to sell your house and give all the money to the Lama, maybe it doesn't mean that would be a fantastic thing to do when and if you're ready to do it. So make a plan to become ready to do it happily. Work on yourself in those ways that it's almost like, I think another good analogy is, and I actually have a friend who's just so amazing. Everyone loves to be with the lamas. Everyone loves that kind of attention. Everyone loves to do, the fun, high profile. Well, not everybody. We're all Buddhists, so some people don't really like high profile, But that could also be 8 worldly dharmas, right? Sometimes maybe you have to put yourself out there. But I have one friend, and she always, when there would be karma yoga, she signs up to clean the bathrooms, to do the crappiest job that there is. And I mean, to me, I just admire her so much. Like, that's always what she does. And she's a little bit behind the scenes. But I look and she's here, and it's almost 30 years later. And she's here and she's devoted and she's still doing those things. So, a grand gesture is lovely if you're at the point where you can do that. But if you're not, stretch yourself a little bit. Maybe you can't do the bathrooms happily. I'll tell you, I couldn't. So, do what you can do happily, and move yourself forward. And we're in it together. So we have our teachers, and we have each other, and we have forums like this where we can get together, and hopefully, not always where I'm the main talker. Grappling in the trenches. I think, gosh, our lamas are invaluable. My holy lamas are invaluable. I don't have access to them all the time, though. Sometimes you just need someone who can kind of relate, who it feels like they can relate to your messed up mind, but also not stay there with you, right? It's like how to have compassion, kind of acknowledging where someone is. Like, all right, let's say someone does something crappy to you and you're my friend. Let's acknowledge that experience, what it felt like, that wasn't nice. Like, I understand how you feel. And then gently reminding you of karma, and gently maybe reminding you of that person's suffering. And, but not in a way of like, well, that's your karma, or, not tuning out the suffering of a Dharma friend, right? But a good Dharma friend walks that balance of meeting you where you are, and then helping you, reminding you or inspiring you to be just a little bit better, to keep trying. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left, and I do feel like I talk way too much. There's a lot to talk about, and how we're dealing with all this stuff. We really are experimentalists. It really is a super personal job, and I know on these calls especially, everybody maybe doesn't want to pull out and like, here's my situation. But know that it's appropriate if you want to do that. I said I was going to shut up. Now I am. I'm going to give a minute and 30 seconds of silence if nobody says anything. And it's okay for it to be silent. And it's okay if you've got a problem with any, I'm not going to say anything. You know, whatever you want to say, if you want to say something, say it.
You hit the nail on the head for me when it comes to being kind to myself. That's one thing that I am working on. And I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because that's not so easy all the time. I can dig around and find all of these little flaws and fix them, but, you know, or work on fixing them. But in the meantime, I'm not so very kind. So
I think one of the things that really helps me, that doesn't feed 8 worldly dharmas, and this isn't the only thing, but one thing that really works for me is gratitude and having a little understanding of karma, just a little bit. And then it's incredibly humbling, because if we really, you know, and to the extent that you understand karma, or to the extent that you've heard of emptiness and understand that, it is proof of your goodness. It is proof. The fact that you have this human body is proof of merit and virtue that you've done. And I think sometimes we're just not, because we're not enlightened, because we're not perfect. I mean, perfection is the goal. That's a marathon. And we won't be able to sustain that unless we really recognize and rejoice in the goodness that we have today. And being attracted to these teachings, you know, being here on a Tuesday night when all of us could be doing, you know, we could be doing Netflix, we could be doing really non-virtuous things, we could be doing neutral things. There's so many things we could be doing. Just that you're here is a big deal. And then all of those little things that we do, taking the time to rejoice. And it's easier to do when we think of it as that fertilizer. You know, if we think of it as a spiritual, I don't know about you, but I could say for me, if I think of it as a spiritual practice, then it's easier for me to do, because I must be a little puritanical, you know, at my core, right? So I'm always finding I know very intimately everything I'm doing wrong. But stopping and thinking about, what did I do today? And maybe it wasn't a lot. Maybe it was a small thing. Maybe it was a kind thought. Right? Our actions are actions of body, speech, and mind. So it doesn't have to always be something that we're doing. But that thing that we've done today, and maybe we just go back, like everything like that we've done over the course of our lives, everything we can remember, you know, revisiting those things and feeling glad, like I'm so glad. And maybe my motivation always wasn't perfect. Guess what? I could change that now. Now I can dedicate those past things towards enlightenment. Oh, even when I did have reputation as the motivator, you know, I did a lot of great things. I was ignorant. I didn't understand, you know, why I was doing them. But now, today, I can be glad that I did them, and I can dedicate them today towards something positive, towards enlightenment for myself, towards enlightenment for other beings. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
yeah, I like that reframe. Thank you.
Anybody else want to? I know we're coming on it. Oh, we're over it. I set the timer at, I guess, 5 minutes after. I don't want to really go over, but I really want us to dedicate, especially given that we just talked about that. I am so grateful to have this opportunity to be with you. The time that we spent here, may it benefit countless beings. May it help us to understand our own mind, to achieve all the realizations of the path, and to help others do the same. And may all of our teachers, Sangha, Dharma friends all have long, healthy lives. Help us and others on the path. Oh, that was my alarm. I'm sorry. So thank you so much. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but continue to increase forever. Thank you. I want to say amen. And my personal email is just my name @gmail.com. So I will say if you've got questions or thoughts or something you want to address next week, anonymously, not anonymously,